health of our guest, let me say there should be encouragement in the founding of this medal tonight for every struggling and ambitious youth in America. Let our sons recall and applaud the cheery little newsboy of Detroit, the half-shod, half-frozen operator seeking bravely a job along the icy pikes of the Central States, the gaunt, untutored experimenter in Boston taking eagerly much-needed fees for lectures he was too modest to deliver, the embryonic inventor in New York, grub-staked by a famous Wall Street man for his first stock ticker, the deaf investigator at Menlo Park, who wreaked novel retaliation on his affliction by preserving human speech forever with his phonograph, the prolific patentee who kept the pathway to the patent office hot with his footsteps for nearly 40 years, the genius, our comrade, who took this little crystal bulb in his hand and with it helped to give the world a glorious new light which never was before on land or sea, Thomas Alva Edison.
It is worth going a long way to chat and shake hands with Mr. Edison. The greatest practical electrician that ever lived is not more interesting than the man himself. We can realize from the strong, resolute look how the boy, whose regular schooling scarcely extended over half a year, succeeded in educating himself by stray reading at newspaper stalls and haphazard studies in telegraphy at the railway signaling station. With all its strength, Mr. Edison's face wears a gentle expression. The suggestion of strength comes out when he is interested in a discussion and driving his point home. A noteworthy characteristic of his face is the attractive smile and the mixture of shrewdness and kindliness of the gray eyes. There is no simpler, more open, more unaffected man than Edison living. He seems as if he had no notion that he was anybody in particular. His shrewd, ready common sense is apparent, even in the smallest things.
Those two eulogies of Edison the man were spoken and written in praise of one of the most remarkable and prolific inventors of all time, Thomas Alva Edison. The first was a toast given at a banquet to honor his profound influence on all our lives. The second, written by an English journalist of the time, shows that Edison was not a citizen of one country, but a man who belongs to every nation that calls itself civilized. When the toast was spoken and the words written, Edison was endearingly called the Wizard. By then, albeit in a humble manner, he claimed that he could invent anything to order, counting amongst his inventions the phonograph, the electric light bulb, the storage battery, and the carbon granule microphone. But to know Edison for these alone is sadly to underestimate the man. In his lifetime, he was granted 1,093 patents, and anything mechanical, anything of a technological nature, anything which could be put to a commercial purpose would instantly arouse his interest.
169 patents on the electric light, the electric locomotive, 147 patents on the telegraph, typewriter, 20 patents on electric motors, the private line printer, the pyrometric motor, 53 patents on one-milling machinery, methods of preserving fruit, manufacturing plate glass, motion picture projector, compressed air apparatus, the vacuum pump, 20 patents on storage batteries, 101 patents on the phonograph, cast iron manufacture, the mimeograph, the fluoroscope, the tasometer, the odoroscope, the motograph, the etheroscope, the vocal engine, wire drawing, dictating machines, electromagnets, circuit directors, pressure relays, the carbon rheostat, grasshopper telegraph, acoustic telegraph, chemical telegraph, telephonograph.
It is little wonder that Edison became a legend of his time, especially when statesmen, emperors, presidents, men of science and of letters all made their own pilgrimage to meet this awesome but very gentle inventor. And it's no further wonder when the story of the man is as remarkable and extraordinary as the man himself. It is the winter of 1847. Nancy Edison of Milan, Ohio, has just given birth to her 7th child in a cold and cheerless room. 3 of her children have already died, and the new child looks destined to follow. The father, Samuel Edison, is a refugee from Canada following the 1838 rebellion there, and had escaped by walking nearly 200 miles without sleep. In this year of 1847, the war with Mexico to the south was drawing to a close. To the west lay untouched, untraveled wastes, although a new religious sect known as the Mormons was just beginning to find a foothold. And in the east, a young man named Abraham Lincoln was entering Congress for the first time. But slowly the whole of this vast country was being welded together by the new railways and the telegraph wires. These were the networks which, linking town with town and city with city, were uniting the emerging nation. But the coming of the railroads didn't bring universal happiness. The small town of Milan on the banks of the Huron had prospered in the great days of the canals, shipping grain along the mighty rivers. But the new railroad had bypassed the settlement, and this meant that Milan was fated slowly to die. The populace moved on, and the Edisons went with them, settling at Port Huron. It was here that the now 7-year-old Al, as he was known, had his first and last schooling.
I remember I used never to be able to get along at school. I don't know what it was, but I was always at the foot of the class. I used to feel that the teachers never sympathized with me, and that my father thought that I was stupid. And at last I almost decided that I must really be a dunce. One day I overheard the teacher tell the inspector that I was addled, and it would not be worthwhile keeping me in school any longer. I was so hurt by this last straw that I burst out crying and went home and told my mother about it. Then I found out what a good thing a good mother was. She came out as my strong defender. Her mother love was aroused. Mother pride was wounded to the quick. She brought me back to the school and angrily told the teacher that he didn't know what he was talking about, that I had more brains than he himself and a lot of talk like that. In fact, she was the most enthusiastic champion a boy ever had, and I determined right then that I would be worthy of her, and show her that her confidence was not misplaced. My mother was the making of me. She was so true, so sure of me, and I felt that I had someone to live for, someone I must not disappoint. The memory of her will always be a blessing to me.
Young Al did not return to school ever again. Instead, his mother, herself a former teacher, gave him all the instruction he needed. Addled or not, he very easily mastered the alphabet in only a few lessons, showing his extraordinary memory. He was a model child, with the mildest of tempers, popular with all and with a good sense of fun. But above all, he was always trying to see how things were done. It is said that he once chased a mother goose off her eggs so that he could squat over them to see how brooding was performed. By his 10th birthday, he had read Shakespeare, Dickens, and a number of large and weighty volumes on history. But when he read his first book on science, he discovered a passionate interest in experimenting, and from that moment, all his pocket money, such as it was spent on apparatus and chemicals. At the age of 12, to help augment the meager family income, Thomas secured his first job as a candy butcher, a seller of candy, newspapers, fruit, and the like, on the Grand Trunk Railroad on the Port Huron to Detroit line. One of his friends explained what it was like.
Well, as near as I can make out, young Al obtained the privilege of selling newspapers, books, fruit, and so on as a favor, or for very small pay, and received all the profits himself. One day he came and asked my parents to let me go with him on Saturdays when there was no school and help him with his work. The train left Port Huron about 7 a.m. and arrived in Detroit at 10 a.m. Returning, it would leave Detroit at 4:30 p.m. and get back to Port Huron at 7:30 p.m. There was a car on the train divided into 3 compartments, one for baggage, one for the United States mail, and the other for express matter. The express compartment was never used, and Al employed it for a printing office and a chemical laboratory. In it were stored jars of chemicals to make electric currents, telegraph instruments, a printing press, some type, and a couple of ink rollers. Well, Al was very quiet and preoccupied in disposition. His mother kept him supplied with clean shirts, and he always washed his face and hands, but I think in those days he did not often comb his hair. Most boys liked to have money, but he never seemed to care for it himself. The receipts of his sales, when I sold for him, were from $8 to $10 a day, of which about 1/2 was profit. Some of our time in Detroit was spent in buying goods to sell on the train, and we would go to the stores and buy papers, stationery, prize packets, fruit, peanuts, oranges, candies, and such. Al was a curious but lovable fella. If you spoke to him, he would answer intelligently enough, but you could always see that he was thinking of something else when he was talking.
Even at this early age, the signs were that this was no ordinary boy. He had drive, he had wits, enterprise, and intelligence in abundance. In his job on the railway, he showed a business head much in advance of his years. Indeed, one of the papers he sold was his very own, reported, written, set, and printed entirely by himself in the express compartment of the train. At its height, it sold 500 copies a week at 3 cents each, and was once even quoted in the London Times, no less. But his printing and experiments came to an abrupt and ignominious end one fateful day when he was just 15. Having made himself some time to spare, Thomas was experimenting with some chemicals in the baggage car, when suddenly the train jolted, and a bottle of phosphorus toppled from the table and smashed. The phosphorus came into contact with the air and immediately burst into flames. Soon a serious fire had started in the wooden car. Fortunately, the conductor, a dour Scot, burst in, and assessing the situation, he quickly smothered the flames and rescued the wretched experimenter. But at the very next station, Thomas, his printing press, his chemicals, and all his scientific apparatus were unceremoniously dumped onto the platform and left there as the train continued on its way. In later years, Edison was sure that the parting cuff given by the irate conductor on his ear was the cause of the affliction which was soon to beset him, his partial deafness. Later still, however, he refuted this story, and it is possible that the strange world of half-sounds that he was to inhabit for the rest of his life was the result of a childhood infection. But he soon found that his deafness was an advantage. It allowed him to shut himself off in his own cocoon of concentration, although, naturally, it had its drawbacks also.
I haven't heard a bird sing since I was 12 years old.
With his imperfect hearing, Thomas became a shyer and more self-conscious young man, and much of his boyishness departed from him.
My refuge was the Detroit Public Library. I started with the bottom shelf and went through the lot, one by one. I didn't read a few books. I read the library.
He was unemployed, but following a chance occurrence, this state was not to last very long. It was a bright summer's day, and Thomas was standing on Mount Clemens station, idly watching as a locomotive was shunting a large boxcar. Eventually, the boxcar rolled towards the platform when, to his horror, Thomas saw the station master's 3-year-old son sitting right in the path of the oncoming car. He immediately rushed towards the child, just managing to snatch him up before the car hurtled by. Disaster was thus narrowly avoided, and the child was duly handed back to a very thankful station master. As a token of his gratitude, in part at least, the station master taught Thomas everything there was to know about telegraphy, which the young man urgently wished to know. Telegraphy had been one of his absorbing passions, and he had built his own crude transmitter and experimented with wires strung between his own house and that of a friend. Now, studying 18 hours a day, within 3 months, he had become a professional telegraphist, and an outstanding one, too. He therefore had no trouble in obtaining the post of night operator at Port Huron, at the grand rate of $25 a month. This meant that he could study and experiment by day and work by night. But he had to sleep sometimes, and since this was usually when he was at work, he frequently found himself in trouble. Finally, quite exasperated, his boss hit on the scheme that in order to stay awake, Edison was to dispatch the letter A every half hour. But he quickly got round this by constructing an automatic device which transmitted the single letter at the required interval, leaving him to sleep on undisturbed. But this state of affairs was not to last. When his device was discovered, Edison was dismissed in disgrace, and began the period in his life in which he was to wander around the country, finding telegraph jobs wherever he could, never settling, never staying anywhere for very long. These, for Edison, were the vagabond years. Sarnia, Stratford, Fort Wayne, Indianapolis, Cincinnati, Memphis, Louisville. Edison saw them all on his travels, taking telegraphy jobs there until he was sacked for disobedience and idleness. The work of a telegraph operator was monotonous and repetitive, at times purely mechanical, and this did not suit Edison. Neither was he one for routine. But he scraped enough money for food and lodging, and any surplus went on apparatus for his studies. He had all the appearance of a country hick, but his talent was beyond dispute, as was frequently proved.
He came walking into the office one morning looking like a veritable hayseed. He wore a hickory shirt, a pair of butternut pants tucked into the top of his boots a size too large, and guiltless of blacking.
Where's the boss?
He asked this as he glanced around the room. No one replied at first, and he repeated the question. The manager came forward and asked what he could do for him, and he proceeded to strike him for a job. Business was rushing, and the office was 2 men short, so almost any kind of a lightning slinger was welcome. He was assigned to a desk, and a fusillade of winks went around the room, for the new arrival had been put on the St. Louis wire, the hardest in the office. At the end of the line was an operator who was chain lightning and knew it. Well, Edison had hardly got seated when St. Louis called. The newcomer responded, and St. Louis started on a long report which he pumped in like a house afire. Edison threw his leg over the arm of a chair, leisurely transferred a wad of spruce gum from his pocket to his mouth, took up a pen, examined it critically, and started in, about 50 words behind. Well, he didn't stay there long, though. St. Louis let out another link of speed, and still another, and the instrument on Edison's table hummed like an old-style Singer sewing machine. Every man in the office left his desk and gathered around the J to see what he was doing with that electric cyclone. Well, sir, he was right on the word and taking it down in the prettiest copperplate hand you ever saw, even crossing his T's and dotting his I's and punctuating with as much care as a man editing telegraph for a printer. Well, St. Louis got tired by and began to slow down. And then Edison opened up the key and said,
Hello there. When are you going to get a hustle on? This is no primer class.
few could better Edison. And another taunt of his to operators who fancied their prowess with the key was,
"Hey there, don't go to sleep. Shake yourself and send with the other foot."
The 5 years that Edison was to spend on the move were to be of inestimable value. These were his formative years. He educated himself in all manner of subjects, literature and languages, as well as the sciences, and in that oversized brain of his, many ideas and notions were forming. Eventually, in June of 1869, at the age of 22, he filed his very first patent. This, he felt sure, would start him off on the long road to fame and success. Patent 90646 was for the design of a novel form of vote recorder for Congress.
In front of each member of the House were 2 buttons, one for aye and one for no. By the side of the Speaker's desk was erected a square frame in the upper part of which were 2 dials corresponding to the class of votes. Below the dials were spaces in which numbers appeared. When the vote was called for, each member pressed one or other of the buttons before him, and the number of votes appeared automatically on the record. All the Speaker had to do was to glance at the dial and announce the result.
Ingeniously simple, and with all the naive optimism in the world, the young inventor proudly demonstrated it to a committee of the Congress. However,
Young man, it works all right and couldn't be better. With an instrument like that, it would be difficult to monkey with the vote if you wanted to. But it won't do. In fact, it's the last thing we want here. Filibustering and delay in the counting of votes are often the only means we have for defeating bad legislation. So though I admire your genius and the spirit which prompted you to invent an excellent machine, we shan't require it here.
this encounter showed to Edison how harsh and unfair the real world could be.
Of course, I was sorry, for I banked on that machine bringing me in money. But it was a lesson to me. Then and there, I made a vow that I would never invent anything which was not wanted or which was not necessary to the community at large.
And he kept that vow. But for the time being, Edison was penniless. He trudged the streets with a bag full of coils, cells, rheostats, and other scientific apparatus. And it seemed as if the whole world was conspiring against him. Then suddenly, his luck changed. One day he found himself in Wall Street, the country's financial center. The Civil War had not long ended, and the industrial boom which had followed the peace was focused in the dealing and gambling here. Fortunes were won and lost on this street. Above the clamor of the dealers could be heard the clatter of the law gold indicators, or tickers, on whose message the price of gold, the lifeblood of this financial world, depended. Then, all at once, within the gold room, the vital tickers stopped. Pandemonium set in. Men rushed frantically to and fro. The noise was unbearable. It was as if the heart of the nation had stopped beating, and no one knew how to revive it. Edison had been watching these antics with mild and detached amusement. He observed the mechanics' fruitless efforts to fix the machines, but more important, his keen eye had spotted what was really wrong. At the same time, Dr. Laws, inventor of the tickers, was helplessly watching the collapse of the company he had so carefully built up. Edison approached him.
One of the contact springs has broken and fallen down between the gear wheels.
Fix it. Fix it, and be quick, for God's sake.
Edison duly obliged, and soon the financial world was back to normal. In recompense, Law offered Edison a job servicing the tickers at the princely rate of $300 a month. Edison quickly accepted. At least he was getting somewhere. In the next few years, he developed his own improved version of the temperamental ticker and was presented for this with a check for $40,000. This was undreamt of wealth for the young country boy, and he couldn't believe that this piece of paper actually entitled him to the staggering amount that was written upon it. Indeed, he had to be told how to go about cashing the check at the bank. He returned to his lodgings his clothes bulging with dollar bills, and couldn't sleep at all that night for fear of being robbed. The next day, following some good advice, he took all the money back to the bank and wisely opened an account. With the money, he founded his own factory, building his own tickers as fast as he could. He still continued with his other experiments, however, and gathered around him a team of highly talented investigators like himself. Yet he still tinkered around with telegraph apparatus, the mechanism he knew and understood best, and eventually managed to produce an automatic. But the effort put into its design was tremendous, as one of his team was to describe.
In the development of the automatic telegraph, it became necessary to have a solution which would give a chemically prepared paper upon which the characters could be recorded at a speed greater than 200 words a minute. Now, there were numerous solutions in French books, but none of them enabled him to exceed that rate. But he had invented a machine that would exceed it, and it must have the paper to match the machine. I came in one night, and there sat Edison with a pile of chemistries and chemical books that were 5 feet high when they stood on the floor and laid one upon the other. He had ordered them from New York, London, and Paris. He studied them night and day. He ate at his desk and slept in his chair. In 6 weeks, he had gone through the books, written a volume of abstracts, made 2,000 experiments on the formulas, and had produced a solution which would do the very thing he wanted done.
This was the manner of the man. Prodigious amounts of hard work, and not a little touch of genius. This invention was followed by the duplex, a device which allowed not one but 2 telegraph messages to be transmitted along the same wire. In turn, the capacity was doubled yet again in the quadruplex, which could send 4 messages simultaneously. This represented the pinnacle of telegraphic achievement. It's hard in this nucleonic age to realize the importance of the telegraph a century or so ago. It was the only device with which one could communicate quickly with places and people hundreds and even thousands of miles away. And in this particular era, when Edison was beginning his life's work, an era of great industrial expansion, communication was of vital importance. 2 vast companies held the major share of the thousands of miles of wire: the Atlantic and Pacific Telegraph Company, owned by the mysterious financier Jay Gould, and the huge Western Union Telegraphic Company, for whom Edison had worked as an operator. But Edison held no allegiance, and the 2 rivals vied with each other for control of his patents, in particular the quadruplex. Both giants were quick to appreciate its potential. It could save millions of dollars, since only 1/4 of the total wires were needed, and 8 people could operate on a single length of wire. Edison found himself a pawn as the great companies maneuvered around him, striving to gain possession of the precious patent. But he didn't mind. He earned $30,000, and with this, he was able to fulfill a long-cherished dream, to establish a place where he and other inventors could work and experiment unhindered, a kind of science factory. It was, in fact, to be the first genuine industrial research laboratory in the world. The spot chosen by Edison was
at Menlo Park, Western Division, Globe, planet Earth, Middlesex County, 4 miles from Rahway, the prettiest spot in New Jersey on the Pennsylvania Railway on a high hill. We'll show you around. Go strawberrying.
At last, Thomas Edison was ready to settle down. Here he could indulge in his every scientific whim. He proudly proclaimed to undertake
research and development on any and all inventions. A minor invention every 10 days. A big trick every 6 months.
The first big trick was not primarily one of his own inventions. In Salem, Massachusetts in 1876, one Alexander Graham Bell was almost bankrupt. He had patented a telephone by which actual sounds, even voices, could be transmitted along a wire. But his device was crude. It didn't perform well, and it looked as if it would be a commercial flop. But the patent laws had to be strictly adhered to, and in consequence, many other suitable devices had to be abandoned. At Menlo Park, however, Edison and his team did succeed in devising and patenting a rival telephone. This used a revolutionary new carbon microphone, incorporating a button made of lampblack as the transmitter, which worked perfectly. Nevertheless, try as they might, they couldn't invent a suitable receiver which didn't infringe Bell's patent. It was a curious situation. Bell's telephone would not work without Edison's transmitter, and Edison's was useless without Bell's receiver. It was stalemate. The simple solution was a merger, but the world of business is seldom so straightforward. Edison sold his device to the Western Union, who sensibly had foreseen the potential rivalry to its own telegraphic interests, and watched whilst the Bell Telephone Company and Western Union fought many legal battles over their priority to the telephone. Eventually, Western Union, after many years of wrangling, sold out to Bell. Characteristically, Edison summed up his own part in the affair.
When I struck the telephone business, the Bell people had no transmitter, but were talking into the magneto receiver. You never heard such a noise and buzzing as there was in that old machine. I went to work and monkeyed around and finally struck the notion of the lampblack button. The Western Union Telegraphic Company thought this was a first-rate scheme and bought the thing out. But afterwards they consolidated, and I quit the telephone business.
It's easy today to forget the long hours of patient toil that go into perfecting a device which is so often taken for granted. To forget the many similar versions found to be equally satisfactory, but for one reason or another were dropped and are now quite forgotten. The telephone is such a medium. Edison alone devised and patented many different versions of the telephone, such as
the water telephone, the condenser telephone, the electrostatic telephone, the chemical telephone, the magnetic telephone, the inertia telephone, the mercury telephone, the voltaic pile telephone, the musical transmitter, and the electromotographic receiver.
The impact that the telephone had made upon civilization should never be underestimated. In just 100 years, the ability for a person to talk directly and immediately to another over a distance of a few miles has expanded to such a vast extent that from one's own home it is possible to converse with friends and relatives on the other side of the world, from Paris to Adelaide, from Lima to Tokyo, by undersea cable, by satellite. That is the measure of progress that has been made. For Edison, the telephone was just another invention, and yet he was starting to achieve a reputation. His name began to be publicly known, and before very long this enterprising inventor was to earn the most lasting of all his nicknames.
The Wizard of Menlo Park.
Of the number of persons in the laboratory, remark one you may least have thought of selecting from the informality of his appearance. It is a figure of perhaps 5 foot 9 inches in height, bending over some detail of work. There's a general appearance of youth about it, but the face, knit into anxious wrinkles, seems old. The dark hair, beginning to be touched with gray, falls over the forehead in a mop. The hands are stained with acid, and the clothing is of an ordinary ready-made order. It is Edison. He has the air of a mechanic, or more definitely, with his peculiar pallor, of a night printer. His features are large, the brow well-shaped, without unusual developments, the eyes light gray, the nose irregular, and the mouth displaying teeth which are not altogether regular. When he comes up, his attention comes back slowly as though it had been a long way off, but it comes back fully and gradually, and the expression of the face, now that it can be seen, is frank and prepossessing. A cheerful smile chases away the grave and somewhat weary look that belongs to it in moments of rest. He seems no longer old. He has almost the air of a big, careless schoolboy released from his desk.
That somewhat clinical description was made by a newspaper reporter when Edison was only 30 years old. The scientist had already undergone a lifetime of hardships, but, as the reporter had discovered, beneath the prematurely old exterior, the heartbeat was still young. Even more important, there was the promise of bigger and better things to come. The years at Menlo Park were Edison's happiest. He had achieved a position where he could do what he liked doing more than anything else, inventing and investigating in perfect peace, without fear of interruption and harassment from the world outside the walls of his laboratory. He had even found time to marry a few years earlier, a Mary Stilwell, who bore him 3 children, Tom Jr., Dot, and Dash. He loved his wife very dearly, and she worshipped him, but both she and the children saw all too little of him. Mary was a shy, gentle girl of 16 when they were married, and certainly she had no disposition to take this rough eccentric in hand. She was working as a telegraph operator in his employ when they met, and Edison obviously found himself attracted to her. He would frequently stand behind her, watching as she worked, until one day she turned around to her employer, of whom she knew very little, to receive a startling proposal.
I've been thinking considerably about you of late, and if you are willing to marry me, I would like to marry you.
Surely one of the most matter-of-fact proposals in history. Mary consulted her mother, accepted, and they were married within the month. The next landmark in Edison's life was to be another of his big tricks, as he called his out-of-the-ordinary inventions. It was, as it happened, possibly the most original of all. It was the phonograph. An accident triggered off the discovery, but it was Edison's genius that was quick to realize its potential.
I was singing to the mouthpiece of a telephone when the vibrations of my voice caused a fine steel point to pierce one of my fingers held just behind it. That set me thinking. If I could record the motions of the point and send it over the same surface afterward, I saw no reason why the thing would not talk. I determined to make a machine that would work accurately and gave my assistants the necessary instructions.
Edison's account, however, is his usual simplification. In fact, it was a combination of unconnected investigations of his that had led to the first idea. The plans were roughly sketched and given to one of his ablest men, John Crucy. On the top was penciled, "Crucy, make this." The technician duly obliged, but was quite unable to fathom out what it was meant to do. He asked Edison.
The machine must talk, Crucy.
Crucy smiled and shook his head, but still went on with the work, following Edison's instructions. When it was completed, they all gathered around the machine with intense curiosity. After a while, the foreman bet Edison a box of cigars that the device wouldn't work. The inventor cheerfully accepted, and having carefully set the instrument in position, bellowed into the mouthpiece.
Mary had a little lamb.
its fleece was white as snow, and everywhere that Mary went, the lamb was sure to go.
This outburst of poetry created a number of wide grins amongst Edison's staff, which persisted as he quickly wound the device back to the beginning. Then the smiles faded. Everyone held their breath, and the handle was turned again. And sure enough,
Mary had a little lamb, its fleece was white as snow, and everywhere that Mary went, the lamb was sure to go.
I was never so taken aback in all my life. Everybody was astonished. I was always afraid of things that worked first time.
this prototype phonograph consisted of a large horn, and the record was a cylinder of tin plate. But many weeks of work lay ahead before the device could be called even satisfactory. Often Edison and his workers would work 60 hours continuously without sleep and with only the lightest of meals. Strangely, the first patent for the new talking machine was not filed in the United States, but in England. In part, it read,
The phonograph is a machine for recording and reproducing sounds, and from a commercial standpoint consists of two articles, one of which is commonly known to the public as the phonograph, and the other as the record. The phonograph, as designated by the public aforesaid, consists practically of a lathe mechanism heaving a revolving shaft to which is attached a tapering mandrel connected by intermediate gearing with a frame arrangement. In this frame may be placed either of two apparatuses, which are called respectively a recorder and a reproducer. Each of these consists of a glass diaphragm, to which by intermediate mechanism is attached either a cutting point or a reproducing point. The record referred to consists of a tubular tablet or record blank of metallic soap, cylindrical on its exterior, and having a tapering bore suitable to be placed in the tapering mandrel. When this tablet or blank is placed on the mandrel,
Reading all this made my head swim. I never before realized what a wonderful and remarkable invention the phonograph really was.
Nevertheless, Edison was quick to see the commercial possibilities of his invention. He imagined it as an office dictaphone, or possibly a substitute for books, maybe recording the procedures in court. But he was prophetically accurate when he suggested,
The phonograph will undoubtedly be largely devoted to music, either vocal or instrumental, and may possibly take the place of the teacher.
he made other predictions also.
It will sing the child to sleep, tell us what o'clock it is, and summon us to dinner. As a family record, it will be precious, for it will preserve the sayings of those dear to us, and even receive the last messages from the dying. It will enable the children to have dolls that really speak, laugh, cry, and sing, and imitation dogs that bark, cats that meow, lions that roar, and roosters that crow. It will preserve the voices of our great men and enable future generations to listen to speeches by a Lincoln or a Gladstone.
Proud words, perhaps. But it must be remembered that for the very first time, sounds could actually be preserved. Hitherto, words, speeches, music, in fact every single sound ever made, had literally disappeared into air forever. Now this simple machine had drastically altered all that. Noises, be they harmonic or discordant, pleasant or distasteful, could be captured on the cylinder and reheard time and time and time again. No wonder the phonograph had such an impact on the times. Great men such as Bismarck, Tennyson, Gladstone, Browning, Stanley, and others visited Edison, all wishing to record their voices for posterity. No wonder that Edison became not only nationally, but internationally renowned. It was flattering to be well known, and to receive such famous people whilst the money for such recordings was most welcome to finance new experiments. But for Edison, well, the phonograph was merely another patent. For his next big trick was only 3 years away. It was to be one of his greatest. Electric light.
In 1878, I went down to see Professor Barker at Philadelphia, and he showed me an arc lamp, the first I had seen. This electric light idea then took possession of me. It was easy to see what the thing needed. It wanted to be subdivided. The light was too bright and too big. What we wished for was little light and a distribution of that to people's homes in a manner similar to gas.
He managed to raise some cash and at once founded the Edison Electric Light Company.
I was fired with the idea of the incandescent lamp as opposed to the arc lamp. So I went to work and got some very fine platinum wire drawn.
Experiments with this, however, resulted in failure. The wire flickered and burnt out. Undaunted, Edison tried again and again with innumerable materials: barium, rhodium, titanium, zirconium, and many others, but with varying degrees of success. He searched around for the right substance for 13 months.
Finally, I thought I would try carbon because we had got very good conditions for it. Well, we sent out and bought some cotton thread, carbonized it, and made the first filament.
The efforts of Edison and his colleagues to secure the first filament went on without interruption for 2 days and 2 nights. Time and again the thread broke at the crucial moment, and it was only Edison's faith and drive that kept the rest going. It tested the patience of them all, for some were beginning to wonder, after all this, would it work anyway? How could a flimsy cotton thread sustain a current high enough to melt platinum?
We turned on the current. It lit up. In the first breathless moments, we measured the resistance and found it was all we wanted. Then we sat down and looked at that lamp. We wanted to see how long it would burn. The day was, let me see, October the 21st, 1879. We sat and looked, and the lamp continued to burn, and the longer it burned, the more fascinated we were. None of us could go to bed, and there was no sleep for any of us for 40 hours. We sat and just watched it with anxiety growing into elation. It lasted about 45 hours, and then I said, if it will burn that number of hours now, I know I can make it burn 100.
Success. But the work to perfect it went on. Cotton might not be the ideal material for the carbon, so other substances were tried: cardboard, millboard, linen of every grade, grape stalks, wood splints, corn stalks, and some 200 different types of bamboo. Everything within reach was in danger of ending up inside a glass bulb. Nothing was safe. Men were dispatched to the corners of the earth to bring back samples of bamboos, and it was with one of these that Edison was finally satisfied. But throughout the long quest, rumors about something special happening at Menlo Park were bound to filter out. Then the press managed to get hold of the story, and suddenly Menlo Park was under siege by news-hungry reporters. Edison issued a press release.
Mr. Edison had encountered several difficulties which he had overcome by inventions already printed, but he had made other discoveries more important than all in the way of making the electric light available, and to disclose them to the public would endanger the success of the entire enterprise. Some delay would occur before application could be made for patents, as they related to materials which were not easily obtained in this country.
Nevertheless, the general enthusiasm was not shared by everyone, as was reflected in an article in an eminent British scientific publication.
All anxiety concerning the Edison light may be put on one side. It is certainly not going to take the place of gas, and its invention would not have been regarded with the anxiety and interest which have been displayed had it not been for the statements of newspaper reporters on the other side of the Atlantic. In the whole specification, we have not one word concerning any new or extraordinary contrivance for dividing the electric light.
How wrong this learned and highly educated writer was shown to be. How right was the untutored rustic to persevere through the long months in search of this beacon of light. Edison proved that electric light, as produced by him, was not only possible, it was highly practicable. But its adoption by the public was slow. The inventor had to show that it worked. He had to prove that his brainchild was worthy enough to replace the universal gas lamp. The story of the building of New York Central Generating Station to supply the electricity for his new customers is but one more story that demonstrates the patience and colossal effort that Edison undertook to breathe life into his inventions. The act of inventing something is one thing. Developing and promoting it is quite another, as many subsequent claimants to the original idea of the light bulb were to discover. Once again, Edison was forced to go to court to protect his rights in several long legal hassles. But the electric light is such an integral part of most lives today, such a commonplace object to have in the house, that no matter who originally hit on the idea of the filament in a glass bowl, Edison should not be denied the right to claim that it was he, above all others, who made it work, made it successful, and made it available to everyone.
I fought for the lamp for 14 years, and when I finally won my rights, there were but 3 years of the allotted 17 left for my patent to live. Now it has become the property of anybody and everybody.
Edison was only 36. He had more than half of his allotted lifespan still to come. But by using every hour of the 24 in each day, he had achieved more than most men could realize in a dozen lifetimes. He had now secured for himself an international reputation, and it might have been assumed that Edison was a contented man. Alas, it was not to be. At the height of the summer in 1883, his beloved wife died. He was heartbroken. His 11-year-old daughter Dorothy helped him as much as she could, but it was of little use. Menlo Park held only bitter memories, and so the birthplace of many of his greatest inventions was abandoned, and within a very short while, the empty buildings became derelict. He looked elsewhere, and was soon building on a far larger scale, for now he had the money which enabled him to build the best. West Orange, New Jersey, was the site chosen for the new inventions factory, and he settled in, adopting his customary frenetic routine. Furthermore, the change of surroundings brought a great change in him, and he took a new wife for himself. She was Mina Miller, a much more forceful character than the gentle Mary had been, and one who tried hard to reform the wayward inventor. Although he was destined never again to invent anything as influential and successful as his phonograph or electric light bulb, the rest of his 42 years of life were to be spent in a whirlwind of activity as he turned his hand to a bewildering variety of inventions. Much of his time was spent in managing and promoting his companies, yet inventions simply poured from his laboratories. Many concerned electric motors, and he built several railway engines and cars which used such motors, and which he vigorously advocated. He made significant advances in the design of storage batteries, and became one of the leading men in the kinematoscope industry. Yet in this massive field of entertainment, Edison for once missed a golden opportunity. At this time in England, a far humbler inventor, William Fries Green, was trying to photograph movement. He had been handicapped for a considerable time because there was no suitable flexible material upon which pictures could be photographed, At last, a British chemist, A. Parker of Birmingham, invented a type of celluloid, and with this primitive stock and a homemade camera, Frieze Greene stood in London's Hyde Park on a cold, blustery day in November 1889 and exposed some 20 feet of film. His success with this led him to concentrate on a moving picture machine, and altogether he took out some 70 patents. Encouraged by the success of his camera and projector, he wrote to Edison suggesting that his camera could be linked with the phonograph to create talking pictures. As far as can be ascertained, he did not receive a reply. In any case, Edison was busy with a form of motion picture entertainment of his own. A fellow countryman, George Eastman, had invented the first effective roll film, and using this, and helped by his English assistant W.K. Dixon, he produced the kinetoscope, the peep show of a mechanical age, as it was called. It consisted of a small cabinet, which, working on the coin-in-the-slot principle, presented about 30 seconds of photographs on some 40-foot length of film. It was first shown publicly in 1893. The programs were of the utmost simplicity: a dancer whirling around, two fencers demonstrating their skill, a child bouncing a ball, and so on. But to those early viewers, they were wonderful, a worthwhile nickel's worth. Pleased with the public's response to his novelty, Edison set about making a number of films to provide a change of program in the kinetoscope parlors that were springing up around the country. He built the world's first studio. It was a rather flimsy creation with a movable top and a central pivot which, by means of a circular track, enabled the whole affair to be turned to face the sun. The whole was covered externally with tarred felt, which in summer turned the interior into a furnace. The unfortunate actors and technicians working inside it in such conditions nicknamed it the Black Maria. At this time, working in Hatton Garden, London, a scientific instrument maker named Robert Paul was visited by two Greeks. They had recently arrived from America, where they'd seen Edison's kinetoscope and had even brought a model back with them. This they placed on Paul's counter and asked him if he could reproduce such a machine in quantity. Paul shook his head, explaining the patent laws. But later, intrigued by the machine, he visited the British Patent Office to check on Edison's specifications. To his surprise, he found that they did not exist. Edison had omitted to patent his invention in Britain. Soon Paul was busily turning out a machine similar to the kinetoscope, but with a subtle difference. He had introduced a refinement known as the Maltese cross, which enabled the films to be shown to an audience rather than to a single viewer as before. But he was still buying his 40-foot film loops from Edison's company. Edison was soon aware of what was going on and sent two agents to find out what was happening. After receiving their report, Edison announced that no films would be sold to anyone in that country whose kinetoscope was not US built. In other words, one of his. This was a great shock to Paul's clients, who by now had spread as far afield as Australasia, Japan, and South America. For their Paul-built machines were obviously useless without films to show. This demand from his customers encouraged Paul to make films in Britain, thus inadvertently starting the British film industry, and also provoking a flow of films which in time were being sold in vast quantities to America, as well as the rest of the world. It was World War I that brought this lucrative export of films to a sudden closure. Edison became fascinated by the newly discovered X-rays, and seemed to fascinate others also.
Dear Mr. Edison, I write to you to know if you can make me an X-ray apparatus for playing against faro banks. I would like to have it attached to spectacles or goggles so I can tell the second card of a deck of playing cards turned face up. If you'll make it for me, let me know what it will cost. If I make a success out of it, I will pay you $5,000 extra in 1 year. Please keep this to yourself. And if you cannot make it, will you be kind enough to give me Professor Röntgen's address? Please let me hear from you. Yours truly.
Edison was now truly famous, and newspapers and magazines eagerly seized on any fresh information concerning the great man. He, in turn, was only too pleased to entertain such visitors, however humble.
Mr. Edison is always glad to see any visitor, except when he is hot on the trail of something he has been working for, and then it is as much as a man's head is worth to come in on him.
His views and opinions were sought on every conceivable subject. He was a natural storyteller, and his interviews were always laced with homely anecdotes. Thus he became, by his own acts, a legend in his own time, the country boy who made good, a kind of real-life Tom Sawyer. Stories concerning his early life abounded, many being true, whilst far more were not, and Edison himself was responsible for as many of the exaggerated tales as the creditable ones. The story of how he forgot his own wedding day was an Edison elaboration, or how he forgot he'd been married that morning, or how once, when he was concentrating so hard on a problem, that he found that he couldn't even remember his own name. Any history of Edison is full of quaint stories, often contradictory, but very frequently containing the merest grain of truth. As a celebrity, anyone who was ever associated with him was solicited for stories about the folk hero, and these too, whether true or not, all helped to elaborate the image. Thanks to the diligence of reporters and his many biographers, much more is known of him than of his contemporaries. For example, his views on drink.
Much liquor is a bad thing for anyone who wants to go through life and work in earnest. Unless taken in very moderate quantities, it deadens all your nerves and makes you feel listless.
He used to smoke 5 large cigars a day, and on one occasion even smoked by accident a whole box of trick cigars he'd made, and never even noticed it. When asked the secret of his own longevity, he replied,
"Don't worry, live long."
He never carried a watch, and never allowed a clock in the laboratory, so his advice to a young inquirer was,
"My boy, never watch the clock."
On another occasion, someone suggested that his deafness might be cured.
"Oh, I'm afraid you might succeed. Supposing you did. Think of the lot of stuff I'd have to listen to that I don't want to hear. To be a little deaf has its advantages, and on the whole, I prefer to let well alone."
Edison? Why, he's the poorest man at dressing that ever lived. Doesn't care what he wears. He'll buy a suit of clothes and come into the laboratory with it just as it came from the store, and the first thing he does is to throw the coat in a dusty corner and sit down where some chemicals have been spilled.
He had a high opinion of the power of the press.
To let the world know through type who and what you are and what you have, which this great world wants, is the secret of success. And the printing press is its mightiest machine to that end.
Naturally, he was the perfect interviewee. His relaxed, charming manner put everyone at ease. And yet, although almost everything is known about Edison and what he thought, there is little to indicate how this man thought, and what made his brain so different from everyone else's. Surely it wasn't just that he worked that much harder. Of course not. Edison was gifted. He was the supreme innovator. He saw every side of a problem, and his razor-sharp insight was unrivaled. His brain was like lightning when it came to consider a mechanical question. Perhaps the nearest that one can get to the real man is a description given by his portrait painter, someone surely who continually strived to understand his subject.
Whilst painting Edison, I learned that he had the mind not of a deductive reasoner, but of a man inspired, you might almost say. He arrived at his conclusions by intuition, and not by mathematical reasoning.
One story at least illustrates this point. He needed to know the cubic capacity of a glass light bulb. he gave the problem to his mathematician, who, after several days, could not arrive at a suitable answer. Edison quietly responded to this by simply inverting the empty bulb, filling it with water, and then exclaiming to the astounded mathematician,
Go ahead. Measure it.
Nevertheless, he must have gained considerable satisfaction from this, for he had always mistrusted mathematicians.
In all the work connected with the building of the first central station, the greatest bugbears I had to contend with were the mathematicians. I found after a while that I could guess a good deal closer than they could figure, so I went on guessing.
And when someone asked him how he could be sure of getting a correct answer, he grinned and replied,
Well, I happen to be a pretty good guesser.
Strange as it may seem, this was a perfect answer, for he was indeed uncannily accurate with his guessing. He had a feel for a problem, a strange intuition. Nevertheless, his story is not one continuous line of triumphs. There were the failures too. He devoted many long years trying to perfect a magnetic ore separator, in which iron ore was extracted from rock by magnetic means. Finally, the project was wound up, and it was estimated to have cost over $2 million. Edison wrote off the loss with a wry smile.
Well, it's all gone, but we had a hell of a good time spending it.
This was typical, for money meant so little to him except as the means to acquire new apparatus and materials for new and more elaborate experiments. Without it, the investigations would have to cease, and this to Edison was unthinkable.
After I have completed an invention, I seem to lose interest in it. One might think that the money value of an invention constitutes its reward to the man who loves his work, but speaking for myself, I can honestly say this is not so. Life was never more full of joy to me when, as a poor boy, I began to think out improvements in telegraphy and to experiment with the cheapest and crudest appliances. But now that I have all the appliances I need and am my own master, I continue to find my greatest pleasure, and so my reward, in the work that precedes what the world calls success.
With this confession, one gets near to the heart of the man. The insatiable curiosity, the tinkering with all things mechanical, the constant search for perfection epitomizes the eccentric inventor. When Edison died in 1931, at the amazing age of 84, having worked for 18 to 20 hours every single day, he was still monkeying around, as he liked to call it. And how the world had changed in those years. It had become more mechanized, more industrial, more civilized. The car was giving freedom to the individual. Houses were lit and heated by electricity. The radio was giving instant communication across land and sea. The cinema and the gramophone provided entertainment to millions. New concrete dwellings were replacing the old decaying buildings. The nation which had given birth to and raised young Al Edison was no longer the country with untapped wealth and riches. It had indeed grown up and matured, and was now ready to take its place as one of the greatest nations upon earth. And in every instance, Thomas Edison, and he alone, had a crucial role to play in the development of the many devices and gadgets and techniques which today shape the civilized world. When Edison died, Herbert Hoover, the President of the United States, proposed that all electricity throughout the country should be turned off for 2 minutes as a mark of respect. But such a homage, although well merited, was found impossible, owing to the great havoc it would have caused within industry, hospitals and homes. But even the suggestion was indicative of the stature of the man. A man from humble country stock, barely educated, but with a gleam in his eye, a love of life, and an overlarge heart. But was this hard-working inventor truly a genius? Edison himself could answer that.
Genius? Genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration.
Then surely, by this standard, Thomas Alva Edison must rank as one of the greatest geniuses of all time.